Hello and welcome to Stories Before Sleep. I want to tell you a story tonight about a man who failed more times than most people ever try anything. But before we get to those 1,000 failures, I need you to understand something about where he came from. Because Thomas Edison wasn't born knowing how to persist through disappointment. He had to learn it, just like you might need to learn it too. Let me take you back to 1847 to a small town called Milan, Ohio. Picture it a modest place where the streets were dirt, where horses outnumbered carriages, where the biggest excitement might be a train passing through town. This is where Thomas Alva Edison entered the world, the seventh child of Samuel and Nancy Edison. His father had fled Canada after some political trouble, and his mother came from a family of teachers and intellectuals. They weren't wealthy, but they valued curiosity. That mattered more than money ever could. Young Thomas was a restless child. His teachers found him difficult. He asked too many questions that didn't fit into their lessons. He seemed to daydream, constantly staring out windows when he should have been paying attention to arithmetic or penmanship. One teacher apparently told his mother that the boy's mind simply didn't work the way other children's minds worked. Nancy Edison made a decision. Right then, she'd teach him herself at home. This choice would change everything about who he became. At home, Thomas devoured books. He read about chemistry, physics, history. His mother didn't stop him from pursuing these interests. Instead, she encouraged them. By age 10, he'd set up a small laboratory in the basement of their house. He mixed chemicals, conducted experiments, read scientific journals that were far beyond what most children his age could understand. His mind moved quickly from one idea to another, always hungry for knowledge, always wanting to know, not just what something did, but why it did it. When the family moved to Port Huron, Michigan, Thomas was around 12 years old. The railroad had just come through, and this fascinated him completely. He spent hours watching the trains, understanding how they worked, thinking about the mechanics of steam and motion. He got a job as a news butcher. That's what they called the boys who sold newspapers and candy on the trains between Detroit and Port Huron. It was a 4-hour journey each way, and Thomas saw opportunity everywhere. He thought to himself, why couldn't I print a newspaper right here on the train? People would buy it. They'd want to know what's happening in the towns we pass through. So he set up a small printing press in the baggage car. He called it the Weekly Herald, and he printed it during the layover in Detroit. Passengers bought copies. He was maybe 13 years old, and he'd already figured out how to create something people wanted. The newspaper didn't last long, but the principle stuck with him. Find a need, create a solution. Around this same time, Thomas became fascinated with the telegraph. The telegraph operators on the train intrigued him. They could send messages instantly across distances that would take days to travel. It seemed like magic to him. He decided he'd learn telegraphy. He taught himself the code, practiced constantly, and eventually became proficient enough that he could work as a telegraph operator. This skill would define the next phase of his life. But here's what's important to understand about young Thomas. He wasn't just learning these skills passively. He was driven by something deeper. He needed to understand how things worked. He needed to tinker, to experiment, to push boundaries. When he was supposed to be doing one job, his mind was already thinking about the next invention. His employers found him frustrating because he'd get distracted working on his own experiments during breaks instead of focusing on his assigned tasks. He felt this pull constantly, this tension between what he was supposed to do and what he wanted to do. There was a restlessness in him that conventional work couldn't satisfy. He knew even then that he wanted to create something significant. He didn't yet know what that would be, but he could feel it pulling at him like gravity. By his late teens, Thomas had worked various jobs as a telegraph operator across different cities: Port Huron, Adrian, Fort Gratiot, He was competent at the work, but he was always thinking about improvements. Why couldn't the telegraph be faster? Why couldn't it do more? These questions consumed him. His supervisors noticed that he was different from other operators. He had ideas. He had ambitions that extended beyond just doing the job correctly. What nobody could have predicted then was that this restless, curious boy would become one of the most prolific inventors in human history. They couldn't have known that his inability to accept things as they were would drive him to change the world. They just saw a young man who didn't quite fit into the normal structure of things, who asked too many questions, who wanted more than what his current position offered. This is where our story truly begins. Not with success, but with hunger. Not with certainty, but with questions. Thomas Edison was about to leave the telegraph business and strike out on his own. He was about to discover that the real education, the one that mattered most, would come not from books or teachers, but from failure itself. He just didn't know it yet. By the time Thomas Edison reached his 20s, he'd worked as a telegraph operator in several cities across the American Midwest and South. The job paid reasonably well for the era, and it gave him access to the latest technology. But more importantly, it gave him time to think. During quiet shifts, he'd sketch ideas in notebooks. He'd tinker with telegraph equipment, trying to improve its speed and reliability. His mind never stopped working, even when his hands were idle. In 1868, while working in Boston, Edison made his first significant invention. He created an electrical vote recorder designed for use in legislative bodies. The device would allow lawmakers to record their votes electronically rather than through the slow verbal roll call process. It was ingenious in concept, a genuine improvement over existing methods. Edison felt confident about this invention. He believed it would sell. He believed it would make him money and establish his reputation as an inventor. He was wrong. When he approached Massachusetts legislators about purchasing his device, they rejected it completely. They explained that the slow voting process served a purpose. It gave them time to negotiate, to change minds, to make deals. A faster system would eliminate these opportunities. Edison learned a harsh lesson that day, saying a better solution doesn't automatically succeed in the marketplace. Politics, tradition, and human nature matter more than pure efficiency sometimes. He felt the sting of that rejection deeply. It challenged his assumption that good ideas naturally find success. But rather than becoming discouraged, he shifted his focus. He moved to New York City in 1869, and this decision marked a turning point. New York thrummed with energy, ambition, and opportunity. The financial district pulsed with activity. Stockbrokers needed faster ways to transmit price information across the city. Edison recognized this need immediately. He developed an improved stock ticker, a device that could print stock prices on paper tape in real time. This invention solved a genuine problem that wealthy businessmen faced daily. In 1870, he sold his design to the Gold and Stock Telegraph Company for a substantial sum. For the first time, Edison experienced real financial success. The company hired him to oversee the manufacturing and installation of his devices. He thought to himself during this period, "I can do this. I can see what people need and I can build it. This is what I'm meant to do." The success validated his instincts. It proved that his ability to identify problems and create solutions had real value. He began to see himself not just as a tinkerer, but as an inventor with commercial potential. With money in his pocket, Edison established his first true workshop in Newark, New Jersey, around 1871. He hired assistants and began developing multiple inventions simultaneously. He improved the telegraph, created a duplex telegraph that could send two messages simultaneously on a single wire, and worked on various other electrical devices. His workshop became a place where ideas transformed into products. He was prolific, energetic, driven by the belief that he could invent anything if he applied himself sufficiently. During these Newark years, Edison also married Mary Stilwell, a young woman who worked in his shop. They had children together. By most measures, Edison's life appeared to be succeeding. He had money, a family, a thriving business, and a growing reputation as an inventor. Newspapers began to notice him. People in the electrical industry knew his name, but success brought its own complications. Edison's obsession with work created tension in his marriage. He spent long hours in the workshop, often sleeping there rather than going home. His mind remained perpetually occupied with the next invention, the next improvement, the next problem to solve. Mary complained about his absence, about his single-minded focus on his work. He acknowledged her concerns, but couldn't change his nature. The pull toward invention was too strong. By 1875, Edison decided to leave Newark and establish a larger, more ambitious laboratory. He'd heard about a small town in New Jersey called Menlo Park, and he envisioned creating something unprecedented, a complete invention factory where he and his team could develop multiple projects simultaneously. He moved there with his family and his closest assistants, determined to create something revolutionary. Before Menlo Park, though, Edison experienced another significant failure that shook his confidence. He'd invested heavily in developing an electrical distribution system for lighting homes and businesses. The technology didn't work as he'd anticipated. The system proved unreliable, expensive to install, and difficult to maintain. He lost money on the venture. More importantly, he lost confidence in his own judgment for a brief period. He questioned himself during the setback. Have I been fooling myself? Am I really an inventor or just a lucky tinkerer who happened to solve one problem? The doubt crept in quietly, the way it does when success suddenly reverses into failure. But this doubt wouldn't last long. Edison possessed something deeper than confidence. He possessed an almost stubborn refusal to accept defeat as permanent. He packed up his operation and moved to Menlo Park in 1876, determined to prove himself again. He was 30 years old. He'd experienced success and failure both. He'd learned that good ideas don't automatically win, that markets don't always reward innovation, and that hard work doesn't guarantee results. But he'd also learned that he could recover from setbacks, that failure didn't have to be final. What he didn't yet understand was that failure would become his greatest teacher. The real education was about to begin. Menlo Park in 1876 looked nothing like what Edison envisioned, but he saw potential in the empty landscape. He built a 2-story wooden laboratory building and surrounding workshops on a plot of land outside the small New Jersey town. He recruited a team of talented mechanics, machinists, and experimenters, men who shared his obsession with solving problems through invention. They called themselves muckers, a name Edison gave to his team because they mucked around with ideas until something worked. The laboratory became Edison's kingdom. He designed it specifically for invention. Different areas served different purposes. One section for electrical experiments, another for mechanical workspaces, for testing materials, rooms for assembling prototypes. Unlike traditional factories that produced one thing repeatedly, Menlo Park could pivot between multiple projects. Edison could move from one invention to another, drawing on the collective knowledge of his team. He'd work on something for weeks, then shift his attention entirely when inspiration struck elsewhere. The atmosphere in Menlo Park was unlike anything else in America at that time. Edison demanded total commitment from his workers, but he also inspired them. He paid decent wages, treated his team with respect, and included them in the excitement of discovery. Men who worked there described the experience as intoxicating. They were part of something larger than themselves, contributing to innovations that might change how people lived. Edison's enthusiasm was contagious. When he believed a project mattered, everyone around him believed it too. In 1877, Edison achieved something that captured the public imagination completely. He developed the phonograph, a device that could record sound and play it back. The principle was simple, but revolutionary. A needle vibrated against a tinfoil-covered cylinder as sound waves struck it, creating tiny indentations. When the cylinder rotated again, the needle traced those same indentations and reproduced the sound. It wasn't perfect. The quality was poor, the sound distorted and tinny, but it worked. For the first time in human history, sound could be captured and preserved. Edison demonstrated the phonograph to the public in December 1877, and the response bordered on miraculous. Newspapers called it the greatest invention of the age. Edison became famous overnight. He was no longer just another inventor tinkering in a laboratory. He became a celebrity, a genius, a man who could seemingly accomplish anything he set his mind to. The phonograph made him wealthy and gave him credibility that extended far beyond the electrical industry. But fame brought expectations that grew heavier with each passing month. Investors wanted to know what he'd invent next. Newspapers demanded interviews and updates. Competitors tried to steal his designs or develop their own versions. The pressure intensified constantly. Edison felt it pressing down on him, the weight of being the man everyone believed could solve any problem, invent anything, overcome any obstacle. He thought about this pressure during quiet moments in the laboratory. They think I'm infallible now. They think every idea I have will work, that every project will succeed. But I know better. I know how many things fail. I know how many paths lead nowhere. How long can I maintain this image? What happens when I fail publicly? The doubt mixed with determination in equal measure. He wanted to prove himself again and again, but he also knew that maintaining such a standard was impossible. Edison threw himself into new projects with renewed intensity. He worked on improvements to the telephone, developed better electrical generators, experimented with various applications of electricity. Some projects succeeded. Others consumed months of effort and resources before he abandoned them. A device for recording telephone conversations didn't work reliably. An electric pen for copying documents proved impractical. A system for wireless communication remained theoretical and never materialized. These failures troubled him more than earlier setbacks had. With the phonograph's success still fresh, every failure felt like a betrayal of his own reputation. He'd promised so much. The public expected miracles. When projects didn't work out, Edison experienced genuine disappointment, not just in the technical failures, but in his inability to deliver on the implicit promises his fame had created. Yet something important happened during this period. Edison began to shift how he thought about failure. He started viewing unsuccessful experiments differently. Instead of seeing them as personal defeats, he began to understand them as information. Each failed approach taught him something about what wouldn't work. Each abandoned project revealed limitations in materials, physics, or current technology. Failure became data rather than shame. He discussed this perspective with his team. Every experiment that doesn't work tells us something valuable. We learn what doesn't work, and that knowledge narrows the possibilities for what might work. We're not wasting time when we fail. We're gathering information. His team began to adopt this mindset. The laboratory culture shifted from fearing failure to embracing it as a necessary part of the process. This philosophical change would prove crucial to what came next. Edison was about to face his greatest challenge, a problem that would require not just brilliance, but the ability to persist through hundreds of failures without losing faith in the ultimate goal. The phonograph had made him famous, but it hadn't prepared him for what he was about to attempt. He was about to chase something that many people believed impossible. He was about to try to create practical electric light. The stage was set. Edison had the laboratory, the team, the resources, and now, most importantly, he had a new understanding of what failure meant. He didn't know yet that he'd need to fail nearly 1,000 times before success came. But he was ready, whether he realized it or not. In the 1870s, electric light existed only in laboratories and demonstrations. Arc lamps, devices that created light by jumping electricity across a gap between two carbon rods, had been developed and could produce intense illumination. But arc lamps consumed enormous amounts of electricity, generated dangerous heat, and required constant adjustment. They worked for street lighting in some cities, but they were far too impractical for homes or offices. Most people still relied on gas lamps, candles, and oil lamps for illumination after dark. These sources produced dim flickering light and posed serious fire hazards. The problem was obvious to anyone thinking about the future. What if electricity could produce safe, reliable, practical light for everyday use? What if homes could be lit by electricity rather than dangerous flames? The implications stretched far beyond simple illumination. If electricity could light homes efficiently, then entire electrical distribution systems could develop. Cities could be wired. Industries could operate around the clock. The economic and social possibilities seemed limitless. Several inventors around the world recognized this opportunity. In Britain, Joseph Swan had been experimenting with incandescent bulbs devices that produced light by heating a filament until it glowed. He'd achieved some success with carbonized paper filaments, but the bulbs burned out quickly and weren't reliable enough for commercial use. In America, other inventors pursued similar paths. The race to create a practical incandescent light bulb had begun, and the stakes felt enormous. Edison understood the magnitude of what this invention could mean. It wasn't just about creating light. It represented a fundamental shift in how civilization could function. Whoever solved this problem would reshape the world. The financial rewards would be substantial, but the historical significance mattered more to Edison. He wanted to be the man who brought electric light to humanity. In September 1878, Edison declared publicly that he would create a practical incandescent light bulb. He told reporters that he'd solved the problem theoretically and simply needed to work out the practical details. He promised that within months he'd have a working system ready for the commercial use. The newspapers ran with the story. Edison, the man who'd invented the phonograph, the genius of Menlo Park, had turned his attention to electric light. The public believed him. Why wouldn't they? He'd delivered on his promises before, but Edison had made a serious miscalculation. He'd underestimated the difficulty of the problem. He'd allowed his confidence earned through previous successes to override his caution. He thought he could solve this in months. He didn't realize he'd need years. More importantly, he didn't understand yet how many different approaches would fail before the right one emerged. He felt the weight of his public declaration almost immediately. He'd committed himself publicly. in a way that left no room for quiet failure. If he couldn't deliver, everyone would know. The newspapers would report his failure. His competitors would celebrate. His reputation, so carefully built through the phonograph's success, could be damaged. He'd created enormous pressure for himself, and he knew it. Edison assembled his team at Menlo Park with specific purpose. He brought in his best experimenters and machinists. He recruited additional specialists who understood electricity and materials science. He created a focused group dedicated entirely to solving the light bulb problem. Unlike his previous work, which often involved multiple simultaneous projects, this effort demanded concentrated attention. Everything else at Menlo Park took secondary importance. The team began testing different materials as potential filaments. They tried platinum, which had a high melting point, but proved too expensive and difficult to work with. They tested carbon in various forms: pure carbon, carbonized cotton, carbonized paper. Each material had different properties. Some burned too quickly. Others didn't produce sufficient light. Some materials worked initially, but degraded rapidly, losing their ability to glow after hours or days of use. Edison approached the problem systematically. He and his team would test a material document. The results analyzed what went wrong and moved to the next candidate. They kept detailed records of every experiment. They measured how long each filament lasted, how much light it produced, how much electricity it consumed. The laboratory filled with failed bulbs, glass spheres containing burned out or broken filaments, representing hours of work that led nowhere. By late 1878, Edison had tested dozens of materials without achieving satisfactory results. The initial optimism that he'd solved the problem quickly began to fade. He realized that his public promises might not be kept. The timeline he'd announced was slipping away. Competitors were making progress. Joseph Swan in Britain reported successes with carbonized paper. The pressure intensified. Edison experienced genuine doubt during this period. He questioned whether the problem was actually solvable with current technology. He wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake by announcing his intentions so publicly. He considered the possibility that someone else might solve it first, that his name might be forgotten, while another inventor received credit for transforming the world. He reflected on this uncertainty during a late-night session. In the laboratory, what if I can't do this? What if I've promised something impossible? The phonograph succeeded because I found the right principle quickly. But this is different. This might require something I haven't discovered yet. It might require a material that hasn't even been invented. How long can I keep trying before I have to admit defeat? The questions haunted him. But even as doubt crept in, something else remained intact, a stubborn refusal to accept that the problem couldn't be solved. Edison decided that if the existing materials wouldn't work, he'd test more materials. If hundreds of candidates failed, he'd test hundreds more. He'd expand the scope of his search. He'd bring in more people, allocate more resources, work longer hours. He'd transform the problem from find the right material into systematically eliminate all the wrong materials until only the right one remains. This shift in thinking marked a crucial turning point. Edison moved from hoping to find a quick solution to committing to a long, methodical process. He accepted that the path ahead would be longer and harder than he'd anticipated. He prepared himself mentally for months, perhaps years of failure. The real struggle was about to begin. Edison's approach to the light bulb problem differed fundamentally from how most inventors worked. Rather than pursuing one promising idea intensively, He created a systematic process designed to test materials rapidly and document results comprehensively. He divided the work into distinct phases. First, his team would identify candidate materials based on their known properties: high melting points, ability to glow when heated, availability, and cost. Second, they'd construct bulbs using each material as a filament. Third, they'd test how long each bulb lasted under electrical current. Fourth, they'd measure the light output and energy consumption. Finally, they'd record everything meticulously in laboratory notebooks. This systematic approach allowed Edison to run multiple experiments simultaneously. While one team member tested a platinum filament, another might be preparing a carbonized cotton sample. A third person could be constructing glass bulbs, and a fourth could be analyzing results from the previous day's tests. The laboratory operated like a well-coordinated machine, with each person understanding their role in the larger process. Edison moved between stations, observing, asking questions, suggesting modifications. The early experiments, roughly the first 100 attempts, consumed late 1878 and early 1879. Edison tested various forms of carbon-charred, paper-charred, cotton-charred wood. He tried different metals and metal compounds. He experimented with combinations of materials, thinking that perhaps a composite filament might outperform a single material. Each experiment produced data. Some filaments glowed brightly but burned out within minutes. Others produced dim light but lasted slightly longer. A few showed promise, initially only to fail after hours of operation. Edison found himself asking the same question repeatedly during these early months. Why do I keep going when nothing works? The question emerged not from despair but from genuine curiosity about his own motivation. He couldn't point to progress in the traditional sense. He had no working prototype. He had no breakthrough moment. He had only a growing collection of failed experiments and a mounting pile of burned-out bulbs. Yet something compelled him forward. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was the belief that persistence itself was a form of progress, even when results remained elusive. Life at Menlo Park during this period took on a particular rhythm. Edison often worked 18-hour days, sometimes sleeping in the laboratory rather than going home. His team matched his intensity. They'd arrive in the morning review, the previous day's results, plan the day's experiments, and work until exhaustion forced them to stop. The laboratory became their world. The outside world, family, social obligations, conventional life seemed distant and unimportant compared to the work at hand. The testing expanded in scope as months passed. Edison didn't limit himself to obvious candidates. He tested obscure materials, rare elements, substances that had no logical reason to work, but might reveal something unexpected. He tested carbonized coconut hair, carbonized fishing line, carbonized beard hair. He tested metals and metal oxides. He tested compounds created specifically for the experiments. The range of materials grew almost absurdly broad. To observers, it might have seemed random, but Edison's logic remained consistent. Eliminate possibilities until only the right one remained. The emotional toll accumulated gradually. Early failures felt like learning experiences. By the 50th failed experiment, they felt routine. By the 100th, they felt like a weight pressing down on Edison's shoulders. He'd promised results. He declared publicly that he'd solve this problem. Months had passed. Newspapers continued to ask about his progress. Competitors reported advances. The pressure intensified with each passing week. Around this time, Edison experienced a moment of genuine crisis. He sat alone in the laboratory late one night, surrounded by failed experiments, and allowed himself to confront the possibility of complete failure. He thought, what if this can't be done? What if the problem requires a material that doesn't exist yet? What if I've wasted months and will waste more months only to discover that the whole approach is fundamentally flawed? What if Joseph Swan solves it first, and I'm remembered as the man who tried and failed? The doubt ran deep. It challenged his self-image as an inventor, his belief in his own abilities, his faith that persistence would eventually yield results. But Edison possessed something beyond mere confidence. He possessed a particular kind of resilience that didn't depend on constant success or positive reinforcement. He could accept failure as a normal part of the process without allowing it to undermine his commitment. He acknowledged the doubt, sat with it for a time, then moved past it. The next morning, he returned to the laboratory and continued testing materials. The small victories accumulated in ways that kept motivation alive. A carbonized cotton filament lasted longer than anything tested previously, maybe 6 hours instead of 3. A particular construction method proved more reliable than others. A new vacuum pump allowed Edison to remove more air from the bulbs, which seemed to extend filament life slightly. None of these victories solved the problem, but each one represented progress. Each one suggested that the right answer existed somewhere in the space of possibilities they were exploring. Edison began to understand something crucial during this period. Learning what doesn't work is itself a form of progress. Every failed material eliminated one possibility and narrowed the search space. Every abandoned approach taught the team something about the physics, involved the properties, required the constraints they needed to work within. Failure wasn't wasted effort. Failure was the process of discovery. By the spring of 1879, Edison had tested hundreds of materials. The laboratory notebooks filled with data. His team had become expert at constructing bulbs, testing filaments, and analyzing results. They developed techniques and equipment specifically for this work. They'd learned how to work with glass at high temperatures, how to create effective seals, how to measure electrical properties accurately. The infrastructure for discovery had been built, yet the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Edison still hadn't found a material that could glow reliably for extended periods without burning out. The search continued. The failures continued. But something had shifted in Edison's mind. He no longer expected quick success. He'd accepted that this would be a long journey. He'd prepared himself mentally for months more of testing. He'd transformed his expectation from, "I'll solve this soon," to, "I'll solve this eventually, no matter how long it takes." The darkest moment approached, but Edison didn't know it yet. He was about to face his greatest test of persistence, a period where failure would accumulate so heavily that even his resilience would be tested to its limits. By the middle of 1879, Edison had tested over 500 materials. The laboratory notebooks documented each attempt with clinical precision. The material tested the construction method, the duration of the test, the results observed. 500 failures. 500 experiments that didn't produce a practical light bulb. The accumulated weight of these failures began to affect everyone involved, including Edison himself. The newspapers that had celebrated Edison's promise now questioned his competence. Reporters who'd written glowing articles about the genius of Menlo Park now published skeptical pieces asking whether Edison had overreached. Some publications suggested that he'd made promises he couldn't keep, that his reputation exceeded his actual abilities. The public narrative shifted from "Edison will revolutionize lighting" 2. Edison is chasing an impossible dream. The criticism stung because it contained an element of truth Edison couldn't entirely dismiss. Financial pressure mounted alongside the public criticism. Edison had invested his own money in the experiments. He'd hired additional workers, purchased equipment, and consumed vast quantities of materials. The costs accumulated relentlessly. His investors, men who'd backed him because of his previous successes, began to question whether they should continue funding a project that showed no signs of yielding results. Some investors withdrew their support. Others demanded progress reports and timelines. Edison found himself defending his work to people who'd once trusted him implicitly. He confronted a difficult question during this period. Am I chasing an impossible dream? Have I convinced myself that something can be done when it actually can't? Is my stubbornness just another word for delusion? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was genuine. Edison had to consider the possibility that he'd committed himself to an unsolvable problem. He'd staked his reputation on it. He'd spent enormous resources on it. What if the answer simply didn't exist within the realm of current technology? His team felt the pressure acutely. The men who'd worked at Menlo Park with enthusiasm and hope began to show signs of exhaustion and doubt. They'd been testing materials for months with nothing to show for their effort. They watched Edison work 18-hour days and felt obligated to match his intensity, but their energy waned. Some workers left seeking employment elsewhere. Others remained, but questioned the purpose of their work. If 500 experiments had failed, why would the 501st succeed? Edison's personal life suffered significantly during this period. His marriage to Mary had already been strained by his obsession with work. Now, with the light bulb project consuming nearly all his attention, he saw his family even less frequently. His children grew up with a father who was physically present, but mentally absent, always thinking about the next experiment, the next material to test. Mary felt abandoned. She'd married an ambitious man, but she hadn't anticipated that his ambition would completely eclipse their family life. The tension between them increased. Edison chose the laboratory over home repeatedly, and each choice created distance that couldn't easily be bridged. Edison also sacrificed his health during this period. He worked such long hours that he neglected proper sleep and nutrition. He developed digestive problems. His hearing, which had been damaged in his youth, deteriorated further. He experienced periods of exhaustion so profound that he could barely function. Yet he continued working, driven by something deeper than reason or self-preservation. He couldn't stop even though stopping might have been the rational choice. The moment of truth arrived in the summer of 1879. Edison sat alone in the laboratory one evening, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of his failures. He held a burned-out filament in his hand, one of hundreds he'd created and discarded. He looked at the notebooks filled with failed experiments. He considered the money, spent the time invested, the reputation damaged. He thought about his family waiting for him at home, about the workers who'd lost faith in the project, about the investors who'd stopped believing in him. He allowed himself to contemplate a surrender. He could stop the experiments. He could admit that the problem was unsolvable with current technology. He could redirect his efforts toward other inventions that might succeed more readily. He could repair his marriage, spend time with his children, pursue projects that didn't demand such complete sacrifice. The option existed. He could choose a different path. But in that moment of contemplation, Edison made a choice that would define not just this project, but his entire legacy. He decided to continue, Not because he suddenly believed success was imminent, not because new evidence suggested he was close to solving the problem. He continued because he'd committed himself to the principle that persistence mattered more than immediate results. He continued because giving up felt like betraying something fundamental about who he was. He thought to himself, I haven't failed. I've just found another way that doesn't work. And finding ways that don't work brings me closer to finding the way that does. I won't stop. I can't stop. Not because I'm certain I'll succeed, but because I'm certain that stopping would guarantee failure. The decision brought a strange kind of peace. He'd accepted that the journey would be long. He'd accepted that more failures lay ahead. He'd accepted that he might sacrifice everything for this goal. But he'd also accepted that the alternative, giving up, was unacceptable. The next morning, Edison returned to the laboratory with renewed purpose. His team noticed the change in him. He seemed lighter somehow, as if the weight of uncertainty had been lifted. He'd made his choice. He would continue until he either succeeded or exhausted every possibility. There would be no more questioning, no more doubt about whether to continue. The decision had been made. The real breakthrough was approaching, though Edison didn't know it. He was about to discover that the answer had been hiding in a material he'd already tested, but hadn't fully explored. The darkest hour had passed. Light was coming. October 21st, 1879 began like countless other days at Menlo Park. Edison and his team arrived at the laboratory with their usual purpose test, another material document of the results, prepare for the next experiment. Nothing suggested that this particular day would be different from the hundreds that had preceded it. The weather was ordinary. The laboratory equipment functioned normally. The team went about their work with the routine efficiency they developed over months of repetition. Edison's attention had recently turned to carbonized cotton thread. He'd tested cotton before, but not in this particular form. He'd been experimenting with different carbonization processes, different temperatures, different durations. Perhaps he thought the way the carbon was prepared mattered more than the material itself. His team carefully carbonized a piece of cotton thread, constructed a bulb around it, and prepared to test it. The test began in the afternoon. They connected the bulb to their electrical circuit and carefully increased the current. The carbonized cotton filament began to glow. It produced a steady warm light, not brilliant but consistent and usable. Edison and his team watched carefully, waiting for the inevitable moment when the filament would burn out or fail. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 2 hours. The filament continued glowing as the hours accumulated. Something shifted in the laboratory atmosphere. The usual routine of documenting failure transformed into something else, the careful observation of success. Workers who'd grown accustomed to disappointment began to allow themselves cautious hope. Edison moved between the bulb and his instruments, measuring the light output, checking the electrical consumption monitoring for any signs of degradation. The filament remained stable. It continued producing light. By evening, the bulb had been burning for over 13 hours. Edison knew that 13 hours wasn't necessarily the limit. The filament might continue burning for days or weeks. He'd found something that worked. After months of failures, after 500 experiments, after public criticism and financial pressure and personal sacrifice, he'd finally discovered a material that could sustain incandescent light for extended periods. He thought in that moment, it works. It actually works. All those failures, all that time, all that doubt, it led here, to this moment, to this simple carbonized cotton filament glowing steadily in this glass bulb. The realization carried multiple layers of meaning. It wasn't just that the experiment had succeeded. It was that his entire approach, the systematic testing, the acceptance of failure, the refusal to quit, had been validated. The method worked. The persistence had worked. Edison made a decision to continue the test through the night. He wanted to know how long the filament would actually last. He wanted to push it to its limits. His team took shifts monitoring the bulb recording measurements, ensuring that nothing went wrong. Edison himself remained in the laboratory, unwilling to leave, even for sleep. He watched the filament glow hour after hour, defying the expectations that had defined the previous months. By the morning of October 20th, the bulb had burned for over 40 hours. The filament still glowed. Edison finally allowed the test to end, not because the filament had failed, but because he'd gathered sufficient data to confirm that he'd solved the fundamental problem. A carbonized cotton filament could produce practical incandescent light for extended periods. The principle worked. The material worked. The design worked. When the news spread through Menlo Park, the reaction was extraordinary. The workers who doubted, who'd questioned, who'd nearly lost faith, they celebrated. They understood what this moment meant. They'd been part of something significant. They'd contributed to an invention that would change the world. Edison's vindication was their vindication. The months of struggle, the accumulated failures, the pressure and doubt, all of it had purpose now. Edison allowed himself to feel genuine joy. He'd been right to continue. He'd been right to persist. He'd been right to believe that the answer existed somewhere in the space of possibilities. The breakthrough validated everything he'd endured, but he also understood immediately that the breakthrough was only the beginning. Creating a bulb that worked in the laboratory was one thing. Creating a practical, affordable, reliable light source that could be manufactured and sold commercially was something entirely different. The real work began immediately after the breakthrough. Edison realized that a carbonized cotton filament, while functional, had limitations. It burned out after 40 hours or so. For commercial viability, bulbs needed to last much longer, ideally hundreds of hours. Edison began testing variations of carbonized materials, seeking something more durable than cotton. He experimented with carbonized paper, carbonized wood, carbonized various plant materials. He also had to solve the practical problems of manufacturing. How could bulbs be produced efficiently? How could they be made affordable? How could the electrical distribution system be designed to support widespread use? The invention of the light bulb itself was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Edison needed to create an entire electrical ecosystem: generators, wiring systems, fixtures, safety mechanisms that would allow electric light to replace gas lighting in homes and businesses. The team's energy transformed completely. Where there had been exhaustion and doubt, now there was purpose and excitement. They worked with renewed vigor, understanding that they were close to something revolutionary. Edison pushed them hard, but they responded willingly. The breakthrough had restored their faith in the project and in Edison's vision. Edison also began preparing the public for what was coming. He invited journalists and prominent citizens to Menlo Park to witness the working light bulb. He demonstrated the technology, explained how it functioned, and described his vision for electrical lighting systems that would eventually replace gas lighting entirely. The newspapers that had doubted him now celebrated his achievement. The narrative shifted from Edison's failed experiment to Edison's revolutionary invention, but Edison knew something that the public didn't yet understand. The breakthrough was real, but it was only the beginning. The hard work of refinement, improvement, and commercialization lay ahead. He'd proven that practical incandescent light was possible. Now he had to prove that it could be made reliable, affordable, and practical for widespread use. The journey toward true success was just beginning. In the years following the light bulb breakthrough, Edison reflected extensively on what the journey had taught him. He became philosophical about failure in a way that distinguished him from other inventors of his era. He famously said that he hadn't failed. 1,000 times he'd simply found 1,000 ways that didn't work. The distinction might seem semantic, but it represented a fundamental shift in how he understood the relationship between failure and success. This philosophy didn't emerge from abstract thinking. It came directly from his experience with the light bulb project. Edison had lived through the reality of systematic failure. He'd tested hundreds of materials. He'd constructed thousands of bulbs. He documented every attempt meticulously. And through that process, he developed a particular way of thinking about what each failure meant. Edison understood elimination as a form of progress. Every material that didn't work eliminated one possibility from consideration. Every failed approach narrowed the search space. If you tested 1,000 materials and 999 of them didn't work, you learned something crucial. The answer lay within the remaining one material. The failures weren't wasted effort. They were the process of discovery itself. They were the mechanism by which the right answer revealed itself. This perspective aligned with the scientific method in a way that most inventors didn't fully appreciate. Scientists formed hypotheses, conducted experiments, and analyzed results. When an experiment didn't produce the expected outcome, it wasn't a failure, it was data. It was information about how the world actually worked, as opposed to how they'd theorized it might work. Edison applied this principle to invention. Each failed experiment provided information about material properties, electrical behavior, construction methods, and physical limitations. He reflected on this during quiet moments in the laboratory. Every experiment that doesn't work teaches me something. It teaches me about the material I tested, about the conditions I created, about what's possible and what's not. I'm not wasting time when I fail. I'm gathering the information I need to eventually succeed. The failures are the path to success, not obstacles to it. This wasn't philosophical idealism. It was practical recognition of how discovery actually functioned. The specific lessons from individual failures accumulated into broader understanding. Edison learned that platinum, despite its high melting point, was too expensive and too difficult to work with for a practical commercial product. He learned that pure carbon burned too quickly. He learned that the way a material was prepared mattered as much as the material itself. He learned that the vacuum inside the bulb needed to be as complete as possible. Air remaining in the bulb accelerated the filament's degradation. He learned that the electrical current needed to be carefully controlled to prevent sudden surges that could damage the filament. Each of these lessons came from failure. Edison couldn't have learned them from success. A successful experiment told him that something worked, but it didn't necessarily explain why it worked or what conditions were essential. Failure, by contrast, provided specific information about what didn't work and why. The accumulated failures created a comprehensive understanding of the problem space. Beyond the specific technical knowledge, Edison developed unexpected skills through the struggle. His team became expert at constructing glass bulbs, working with materials at high temperatures, measuring electrical properties, and analyzing data systematically. They developed new equipment and techniques specifically for testing filaments. They learned how to work collaboratively on complex problems, how to document their work clearly, how to communicate findings effectively. These skills, developed through months of failure, became valuable assets that extended far beyond the light bulb project. Edison also built profound resilience through the experience. He'd faced public criticism, financial pressure, doubt from his team, and his own internal questioning. He'd persisted through all of it. He'd learned that he could endure disappointment, that he could continue working when progress seemed impossible, that he could maintain commitment to a goal even when success appeared unlikely. This resilience became part of his character. It shaped how he approached subsequent challenges. The wisdom Edison gained couldn't have been taught through lectures or books. It had to be earned through experience. He understood viscerally, not just intellectually, that meaningful achievement requires sustained effort over extended periods. He understood that setbacks don't negate progress. He understood that the path to success is rarely direct. He understood that persistence matters more than initial talent or intelligence. These insights came from living through the reality of failure, not from thinking about it abstractly. Edison also learned something about human nature through this experience. He discovered that people respond to genuine commitment. His team had nearly lost faith in the project, but when Edison made his choice to continue, they responded. They saw his determination and matched it with their own. He learned that leadership during difficult periods requires more than technical knowledge. It requires the ability to maintain vision and purpose when circumstances suggest that vision might be unrealistic. The light bulb project also taught Edison about the relationship between invention and commercialization. Creating something that worked in the laboratory was only the first step. Making it practical, affordable, and reliable for widespread use required different skills and different thinking. Edison learned that true innovation extended beyond the moment of discovery. It included the entire process of refinement, testing, manufacturing, and distribution. This understanding shaped how he approached subsequent inventions. Perhaps most importantly, Edison learned that failure was not the opposite of success. It was a necessary component of success. You couldn't have one without the other. The failures weren't unfortunate obstacles on the path to success. They were the path itself. Understanding this fundamentally changed how Edison viewed his work. It removed the shame from failure. It transformed failure from something to be avoided into something to be embraced as part of the process. This philosophy would guide Edison through the rest of his career. He'd go on to develop over 1,000 patents. Many of those patents came from projects that involved numerous failures before achieving success. But Edison approached each project with the confidence that came from understanding failure's role in discovery. He knew that failures would come. He knew they would provide the valuable information. He knew that persistence would eventually yield results. The lessons Edison learned during the light bulb quest extended far beyond invention. They applied to any endeavor requiring sustained effort toward a difficult goal. They applied to learning, to problem solving, to personal growth, to any situation where initial attempts don't produce desired results. Edison had discovered something universal about how humans achieve meaningful goals. And now, as we consider what his journey means for our own lives, we need to understand what he learned. The light bulb breakthrough in 1879 established Edison as America's preeminent inventor, but he understood something crucial that many people missed. The light bulb itself was only part of a much larger invention. Creating a practical incandescent bulb meant nothing if people couldn't use it. You needed electrical generators to produce the current. You needed wiring systems to distribute that current to homes and businesses. You needed fixtures and switches and safety mechanisms. You needed an entire infrastructure designed to support electric lighting. In many ways, the electrical distribution system was a bigger invention than the light bulb itself. Edison threw himself into developing this system with the same intensity he'd applied to the light bulb. He designed generators, created wiring standards, developed safety protocols, and planned how cities could be wired for electricity. He established the first electric power station on Pearl Street in New York City in 1882. This station provided direct current electricity to nearby buildings, creating the first practical electrical grid in America. The system worked, but it had limitations. Direct current could only travel short distances before losing power. This restricted how far the electrical system could extend. Edison's vision for electrical distribution faced serious competition. Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse championed alternating current, which could travel much longer distances. A fierce battle erupted over which system would become the standard for American electrical infrastructure. This conflict, known as the War of Currents, consumed enormous amounts of Edison's time and energy. He fought to promote direct current, invested heavily in direct current systems, and worked to convince cities and investors that his approach was superior. But the War of Currents didn't go as Edison hoped. Alternating current proved more practical for large-scale distribution. Gradually, cities and utilities adopted alternating current systems rather than Edison's direct current approach. For Edison, this represented a significant defeat. He'd committed resources and reputation to a technology that ultimately lost out to a competitor's approach. The experience was painful, but it didn't destroy him. He'd learned through the light bulb project how to persist through setbacks. He accepted the loss and moved forward. Edison also continued refining the phonograph, the invention that had made him famous. The original phonograph recorded sound on tinfoil-covered cylinders, but the sound quality was poor, and the cylinders were fragile. Edison spent years improving the design. He experimented with different materials for the recording surface. He refined the mechanical components. He worked to improve sound quality and durability. The phonograph underwent multiple iterations, each one representing an attempt to make the device more practical and commercially viable. He thought about this constant drive for improvement. I could stop now. I've already invented the phonograph. I've already invented the light bulb. I've already created the electrical distribution system. I could rest on these accomplishments. But I can't. I see how these inventions could be better. I see problems that need solving. I see improvements that could be made. Stopping feels like giving up, like accepting something less than what it could be. This restlessness drove Edison forward. He was never satisfied with what he'd created. He always saw room for improvement. The principle Edison had learned through the light bulb project, that persistence and systematic effort could overcome obstacles, became his standard approach to all subsequent work. When he encountered a problem, he didn't look for a quick solution. He assembled a team, broke the problem into manageable components, and worked systematically through possibilities. He tested approaches, documented results, learned from failures, and refined his understanding. The method had worked for the light bulb. It could work for other problems too. Over the course of his lifetime, Edison accumulated over 1,000 patents. This number represented far more than just successful inventions. It represented thousands of experiments, countless failures, and an extraordinary commitment to systematic innovation. Some of his patents became commercially successful and changed how people lived. Others remained theoretical or found only limited application. But each patent represented an attempt to solve a problem, to improve a process, or to create something new. Not all of Edison's later projects succeeded. He invested heavily in an electric vehicle, believing that electric cars would eventually replace gasoline-powered automobiles. The technology didn't develop as he'd anticipated. He worked on a system for recording and transmitting electricity wirelessly, a concept that remained impractical with the technology available. He developed various electrical appliances and devices, some of which found markets and others that didn't. He pursued mining operations, cement manufacturing, and other ventures that consumed time and resources without producing significant returns. These later failures might have discouraged someone who hadn't learned the lessons of the light bulb quest. But Edison approached them differently. He understood that failure was part of the process. He didn't expect every project to succeed. He expected that some would fail, that some would teach him valuable lessons, and that some would eventually lead to breakthroughs. He maintained the same systematic approach, the same commitment to documentation and analysis, the same willingness to persist through setbacks. Edison's later years saw him less focused on creating individual inventions and more focused on establishing research laboratories and supporting other inventors. He created the first true research and development facility, a place where innovation could happen systematically rather than through individual genius. He understood that the future of invention lay not in one brilliant person working alone, but in teams of skilled people working collaboratively on complex problems. The accumulation of over 1,000 patents created a particular kind of legacy. It demonstrated that sustained effort at systematic thinking and refusal to accept failure as permanent could produce extraordinary results. Edison's patents weren't all equally important. Some changed the world. Others were minor improvements or dead ends. But collectively, they represented a lifetime commitment to innovation, improvement in problem solving. What made Edison's legacy significant wasn't just the inventions themselves, but the approach he developed and demonstrated. He'd shown that innovation could be systematic rather than accidental. He'd shown that failure could be productive rather than destructive. He'd shown that persistence mattered more than initial brilliance. He'd shown that complex problems could be solved through methodical effort and team collaboration. These principles extended far beyond invention. They applied to any domain where humans attempted to achieve difficult goals. Thomas Edison, the legend, the genius inventor, the man who persisted through 1,000 failures, the visionary who transformed the world, bears only partial resemblance to Thomas Edison the person. The real Edison was more complicated, more flawed, and more human than the mythology suggests. His first marriage to Mary Stilwell deteriorated significantly during the light bulb years. Mary felt neglected and abandoned. Edison's obsession with work left little room for family life. He missed important moments with his children. He was physically present, but emotionally distant, his mind always occupied with the next experiment or problem to solve. Mary died in 1884, and Edison carried guilt about their relationship for the rest of his life. He'd sacrificed his marriage on the altar of invention. Edison married again in 1886 to Mina Miller, a woman from a wealthy family. This marriage proved more successful partly because Mina understood and accepted Edison's nature, but even this relationship required compromise. Edison's work remained his primary focus. Family obligations took secondary importance. His children grew up with a father whose greatest love was his laboratory, not his household. Edison experienced genuine doubt and fear despite his public image of unwavering confidence. He worried about failure. He questioned his own judgment. He felt the weight of expectations. During the darkest moments of the light bulb project, he'd contemplated giving up. He wasn't fearless. He was afraid, but he continued anyway. That distinction matters. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's action despite fear. Edison also held views and made decisions that we'd now recognize as problematic. He opposed alternating current partly for legitimate technical reasons, but also partly because he couldn't accept that Westinghouse's approach might be superior to his own. His competitive nature sometimes manifested as pettiness. He could be difficult to work with, demanding and unwilling to acknowledge others' contributions to his successes. He thought during moments of reflection, "I've created things that changed the world. But what have I sacrificed? My marriage? Time with my children? Relationships that might have brought me joy? I've gained fame and success, but at what cost? Would I make the same choices if I could live again?" These questions haunted him, though he rarely voiced them publicly. Edison was driven by more than just a desire for fame or fortune. He possessed genuine curiosity about how things worked. He wanted to solve problems. He wanted to create things that improved people's lives. But he was also driven by ego, by the need to be recognized as the greatest inventor of his era, by competitions with other inventors. These motivations mixed together in ways that Edison himself probably didn't fully understand. The price of his genius was substantial. He sacrificed personal relationships, health, and simple human connection for his work. He achieved extraordinary success, but that success came at a cost that extended beyond just his own life. His family paid a price for his obsession. His workers paid a price through the demands he placed on them. Society benefited from his inventions, but those close to him experienced the consequences of his single-minded focus. Edison never fully resolved the tension between his achievements and his regrets. He was proud of what he'd created, but he also recognized what he'd lost in the pursuit of those creations. He was a man of contradiction, brilliant and flawed visionary, and petty generous and selfish all at the same time.